My daughter laid out the condition. If I wanted to see my grandson on his birthday, I had to stay silent about my military service. Her rich, hypocritical in laws who had despised me for years considered my memories unworthy of their party. They didn't know yet that their own family fortune was built on the blood of soldiers just like me. I was in my workshop, finishing a hand carved wooden plane for my grandson, Leo. His sixth birthday was Saturday. When my daughter Sarah's name flashed on my phone, I smiled, but the second I heard her voice, I knew. She was walking on a tightrope. Hey, Dad, she started, her voice thin. About Saturday? Leo is so excited to see you. I told her I was excited too, that I just finished his gift, but she cut me off. Dad, she said, followed by a long, shaky silence. There's just one small thing. You know how the Hendersons are. This story is just getting started, and the layers run deep. If you're new here and want to follow this journey to the end, consider subscribing. You won't want to miss what happens next. Oh, I knew. Richard and Eleanor Henderson, my daughter's old money in-laws. From the moment she married their son, David, they had treated me as something distasteful. To them, I was just Mark, the ex-military grunt. My 20 years of service, to them it was messy. It wasn't an appropriate conversation. What is it this time, Sarah? I asked, my grip tightening on the small wooden plane. Well, she stammered, they're hosting, and they would prefer it if you didn't talk about the army. I almost dropped the gift. What did you just say? Please, Dad, don't be mad, she rushed on. It's not me. It's just... Eleanor used the word unpleasant. And Richard, he implied you were bragging. Bragging. That one word hit me like a gut punch. I thought of the sand, the 18-hour patrols, the friends I'd lost. Bragging? I only ever answered questions, but to them, any mention of a world outside their polished bubble was a threat. So let me get this straight, I said, my voice dangerously calm. To come to my own grandson's birthday, I'm forbidden from mentioning 20 years of my life? It's not like that, she insisted, her voice weak. It's just for one day, just so things go smoothly. David agrees. We don't want any tension. Tension, I repeated. The tension is caused by me, is that it? Not by your father-in-law, who looks at me like I'm something he stepped in? Not by your mother-in-law, who once asked me if it was hard to adjust to using proper silverware? Dad, that's not fair. What's not fair, Sarah, is that they are so deep in your head that you're asking your own father to erase his identity. This is who I am. I could hear her starting to cry. This was their tactic. They used Sarah as a shield, knowing I'd never want to truly hurt her. They'd been limiting my time with Leo for years, making passive-aggressive comments about my simple gifts. But this was a direct order. Dad, please, she sniffled. I'm caught in the middle. Please, just this once. For me, for Leo. I closed my eyes. I saw Leo's face. They were using my love for my grandson as leverage to humiliate me. Fine, I said. The word was cold and sharp. Oh, thank you, Dad. I said fine, Sarah, I interrupted. I'll be there. And I won't say a word about my unpleasant life. You tell the Hendersons they have your compliance. I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from sadness. It was rage. A cold, quiet, disciplined rage. They wanted me to be silent. Fine. They might not like my army stories, but they had just invited a soldier on a reconnaissance mission into their home. I stood in the silence of my workshop for a long time, the smell of sawdust and wood stain doing nothing to calm me. The little wooden airplane in my hand felt heavy, a symbol of a connection they were trying to sever. This wasn't just about a party. This was about years of quiet erosion, a slow, methodical campaign by the Hendersons to push me to the margins of my daughter's life. I remembered Sarah as a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, sitting on my lap as I polished my service boots. She'd trace the flag on my uniform sleeve with her small finger, her eyes wide with admiration. My daddy's a hero, she used to tell her friends. She'd beg me to come to her school for career day, and I'd stand there in my dress uniform while she beamed, holding my hand. Where did that girl go? She went to an Ivy League college, that's where? It was something she'd earned, and I was incredibly proud. But that's where she met David Henderson, and that's when everything began to change. When she brought him home, I tried to be open minded. He was polite, but in a way that felt rehearsed, like he was meeting a zoo animal. Then I met his parents, Richard and Eleanor, and I understood. From our very first handshake, Richard looked at me, not at me, but through me. He sized up my flannel shirt, my work worn hands, and my modest home in a single dismissive glance. Eleanor was worse. She smiled, but it never, ever reached her cold, calculating eyes. That first dinner, she'd picked at the food my late wife had taught me to cook, asking, "Oh, is this a regional dish?" Over the years, the slights piled up, like a death by 1,000 cuts. There was the time they accidentally forgot to tell me about Leo's grandparents' day at his exclusive preschool. I only found out when I saw the pictures Sarah posted a week later. Richard and Eleanor, front and center, smiling with Leo. When I asked Sarah, she stammered, "Oh, Dad, it just slipped my mind. It was a crazy week." But I knew they had controlled the guest list. Then there was the incident with my truck. It's an older model, but I keep it in perfect condition. I'd driven over to pick up Leo and Eleanor was on the porch. "Oh, Mark," she'd said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Are you sure that vehicle is safe? We'd be devastated if anything happened." She then insisted in the kindest sounding, most insulting way possible that they buy me a proper car seat, implying mine wasn't good enough for their grandchild. Richard, for his part, simply treated me as if I were invisible. At family gatherings, if I ever tried to join a conversation about current events, he would wait for me to finish, give a tight little nod, and then immediately turn to David and say, "As I was saying about the derivatives market," it was a clear, unspoken message. Your opinions are worthless. Your world is small. But this new ultimatum was different. It wasn't a subtle dig or a passive-aggressive maneuver. This was a direct, hostile order. They weren't just insulting my truck or my cooking anymore. They were insulting the very core of my identity. They were demanding I disavow the 20 years I spent serving my country, the very service that protected the civilized world they so enjoyed. They weren't just trying to sideline me, they were trying to erase me. And they were using my daughter as their weapon and my grandson as their hostage. I put the wooden plane down on the workbench. The rage from the phone call had cooled, settling into something else. Something colder and much more dangerous. Resolve. I would go to that party. I would play their game. I would be the quiet, invisible old man in the corner. But as I stood there, I felt my old training click into place. You don't win a fight by yelling. You win it by observing, by finding the weakness, by understanding what the enemy truly values. And I was going to find out exactly what the Hendersons were so desperate to protect. When Saturday arrived, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I put on a simple, clean button-down shirt and my best pair of jeans, an outfit I knew they'd secretly ridicule, and drove my truck to their sprawling, sterile mansion. I parked on the street, not even bothering to see if they'd left space for me in their massive driveway. I walked in. The house was exactly as I remembered. All white walls, sharp angles, and glass, like an art gallery no one was allowed to touch. It was filled with people in expensive clothes, all talking in low, self-important murmurs. I immediately felt like an outsider, which of course was their goal. Then I saw him. "Grandpa!" Leo yelled, breaking free from a group of other children and barreling into my legs. For that 1 second, the rage vanished. I hugged him tight, knelt down, and gave him the small wooden airplane from my pocket. His eyes lit up. A jet! Wow, thank you, Grandpa. He started making whooshing sounds immediately, running in circles. Sarah rushed over, her face a mask of forced relief. Dad, you made it. David, her husband, hovered behind her, giving me that weak, awkward nod. Mark, good to see you. Then the Hendersons glided over. Mark, Eleanor said, her smile as thin as a razor wire. How nice that you could come. Richard just gave me a curt nod, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. I kept my promise. I found a corner on their massive patio, took a glass of water, and just watched. I was the invisible man, the quiet old man in the corner. I watched Leo play, and that was enough for me. For a while. But a soldier on recon can't just turn off his training. I watched Richard Henderson. He was the perfect host, gliding from group to group, laughing that fake, booming laugh. But his eyes were tense. He kept checking his phone. He looked hunted. After about an hour, I went inside to find the restroom. I walked down a long, white hallway away from the noise of the party. As I passed a room, what looked like Richard's private study, I heard voices. The heavy door was cracked open just an inch. I heard his voice, but it wasn't the smooth, confident host I'd just seen. This voice was low, sharp, and laced with something I knew well: fear. I don't care what it costs, Richard was hissing. This old business cannot come out, ever. Another voice, deeper and calmer, replied, It's being contained, but the risk is... Don't talk to me about risk, Richard snapped. We're talking about total ruin. The reputational damage is... It's unthinkable. It would destroy everything we've built, everything my father built. Richard, calm down. No one is looking for it, the other man said. Just keep it buried, Richard ordered. I mean buried. Understand? Now get out of here before someone sees you. My heart was pounding. I quickly stepped back into a small alcove just as the door opened. A man I didn't recognize, tall, wearing an expensive suit that looked more like armor, strolled out. He didn't look at me. His face was like stone. He walked quickly toward a side exit and was gone. A moment later, Richard Henderson emerged from the study. He smoothed his tie, took a deep breath, and that fake, polished smile slid back onto his face. He didn't see me in the shadows. He just straightened his jacket and walked back toward the party. I stood frozen in the hallway. My mind was racing. Old business. Total ruin. Reputational damage. The way he'd said it. This wasn't some minor financial problem. This was raw panic. My military instinct, the one that tells you when a target is vulnerable, was screaming. The perfect Richard Henderson, the man who judged me for my service, was terrified of his own past. And I had just found the first thread. I didn't stay at the party much longer. I couldn't. My mind was electrified by what I had heard. I found Leo, gave him another tight hug, and told him his airplane was a top secret model. He giggled and flew it right into my shoulder. I gave Sarah a kiss on the cheek. She looked relieved that the day had passed without tension, and gave a simple, neutral nod to Eleanor and Richard. Richard, who was back to holding court by the pool, barely even registered my departure. His eyes were still scanning the crowd, but now I knew he wasn't looking for friends. He was looking for threats. The drive home was different. The cold rage I'd felt for days was still there, but it now had a focus. It was no longer a blunt instrument, it was a precision tool. Old business. Total ruin. Reputational damage. What could possibly have that kind of power over a man like Richard Henderson, a man who built his entire identity on being untouchable? I got back to my workshop, but instead of working with wood, I sat down at my old desktop computer. I'm no computer genius. I can't hack into bank accounts or anything like that. But 20 years in the service teaches you something valuable. It teaches you how to read people, how to follow trails, and how to use every piece of public information available. It's about patience and connecting dots that other people don't see. I started with the company Henderson Global Ventures. Their website was a masterpiece of corporate nonsense. It was full of glossy photos of shipping containers, skyscrapers, and smiling, diverse teams. It talked about legacy, integrity, and forward thinking solutions. It was all designed to look impressive while saying absolutely nothing. The About Us page was what interested me. It claimed a proud, multi generational history founded by Richard's father, Charles Henderson. It painted a picture of a smooth, respectable line of succession. But I've learned that the glossier the surface, the more it's designed to hide. I bypassed the marketing fluff and went straight for public records: business registries, news archives, property filings. It took hours, but I started to see what they didn't want people to see: gaps. For a company with a proud history since the 1960s, their public footprint in the 1970s and early 80s was almost invisible. The company name changed twice. There were holding companies that seemed to appear, absorb other assets, and then dissolve just a few years later. It was a shell game, a legal but intentionally confusing maze. This wasn't the straight line of success they bragged about. This was the work of someone deliberately covering their tracks. What was this old business Richard was so scared of? The way he said it, it sounded dirty. It sounded like a foundational secret. I typed Charles Henderson, 1970s, into a deep news archive search. Most of what came up was the expected society page garbage: Richard's father, Charles, at some black tie event, or donating a small, tax-deductible amount to a museum. But then I found a brief mention of a legal dispute. It was small, from a local paper in another state, dated 1979. It mentioned a supply contract with a local manufacturer that had gone bad. The case was dismissed quickly and quietly. It was almost nothing. A dead end. But the word supply stuck with me. I decided to switch tactics. If the old business was buried too deep, maybe the man guarding it had his own weaknesses. I shifted my search from the company to Richard Henderson himself. What was he doing in the late 70s while his father was busy playing shell games with the company? He would have been in his early 20s, college age. I found his university records. He'd attended the same Ivy League school as his son. I scrolled through alumni notes, old campus newsletters, and then I found it. It was a single line in a 1978 alumni update. Richard Henderson has taken a temporary leave of absence from his studies to pursue opportunities abroad. That seemed normal, except I checked the dates. 1978. That was right in the middle of the post-Vietnam era, but the draft lottery was still a very recent memory. Many were still serving. I wondered what opportunities were so important that a rich kid would suddenly leave a prestigious school. I felt a new thread pull taut. It wasn't the main secret, but it was a secret, and it was a start. This leave of absence in 1978, it just didn't sit right with me. I've known men from that generation. When you were a young man of draft age in the 70s, your life revolved around one thing: your lottery number. You didn't just take a break from an Ivy League school for vague opportunities abroad, unless you were either running from something or running to something your family had arranged. My instincts told me this was an evasion. The Hendersons, with their obsession with image and legacy, what if their legacy included a coward? I spent the next 2 days digging into something I knew a little about: the selective service system. I searched the public archives for the draft lottery records from 1975 to 1978. I already knew Richard's birth date from my initial background search. It took some cross-referencing, but then I found it: his birth date. In the 1976 lottery, his number wasn't just called, it was low. Very low. He would have almost certainly been called for an examination, and likely for service. So he was called, but he never went. I went to the National Personnel Records Center website. It's a place where you can, as a member of the public, request basic, unclassified service information. I filled out the form for Richard C. Henderson with his date of birth and college location. I paid the small processing fee. Then I waited. While I waited for that official reply, I felt a new kind of anger. It was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I kept picturing his face at the party, that dismissive, arrogant sneer when he looked at me. The man who thought my stories were unpleasant. The man who let his wife call me a braggart. The hypocrisy was suffocating. I thought about the men I served with. Men who didn't have rich daddies to pull strings. Men who got their low numbers and just went. Men who faced the unpleasant realities he was so desperate to avoid, all while he was probably on some opportunity abroad, which I now suspected was just a fancy term for hiding. A week later, an email arrived. It was the official response from the Records Center. I opened the attached letter. It was short, to the point, and exactly what I expected. A search of the records of the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps has failed to find any record of active military service for Richard C. Henderson with the identifiers provided. No record of service. I leaned back in my chair. He had a low number, but he never served. There were only a few ways that could happen. He could have fled the country, which didn't fit their legacy narrative, or he could have gotten a deferment. Given his family's money and status, a student deferment might have run out, leaving only one reliable option: medical. He'd found a way out. Some doctor, paid by his father Charles, likely discovered a condition, a fake diagnosis. This man who looked at me like I was dirt beneath his feet was a fraud. He was a coward who had wrapped himself in the flag of respectability his whole life, while judging the very people who actually served it. This wasn't the old business I'd overheard at the party. That felt different, bigger. This was personal. This was the key to his character. I printed the official letter. This was my first piece of ammunition. It wasn't enough to destroy him, not yet. But it was enough to make him bleed. And now I was more determined than ever to find out what old business a man like this would be so terrified of anyone discovering. This draft dodger was hiding something far worse, and I was going to find it. The letter confirming Richard was a draft dodger was satisfying, but it wasn't the total ruin I'd heard him panicking about. That was something else. That was about the old business. His personal cowardice just confirmed my theory. A man who would lie to avoid serving his country would have no problem lying for profit. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The problem was his father, Charles Henderson, and that confusing shell game of companies I'd found earlier. I went back to that single dismissed legal dispute from 1979 about a supply contract. It felt like a loose thread. This time, I didn't search for Henderson Global Ventures. I searched for the other company named in that old lawsuit, the one that had been absorbed and dissolved. I cross-referenced that forgotten company name with archives of government spending. It was tedious, slow work, like sifting sand for a single speck of gold. It took a full day. And then I hit it. It wasn't a big, flashy headline. It was a tiny article buried deep in the archives of a trade journal from 1980. The headline was simple: Substandard Materials Investigation Halted. My heart started to pound. The article detailed a brief, quickly squashed inquiry into a company called CH Industrial, which I now knew was one of Charles Henderson's shell companies. The company had a contract with the Department of Defense. They were supplying components, simple things like bolts and fasteners for use in non-critical vehicle maintenance. The article was vague, full of legal jargon, but it mentioned an internal whistleblower who had alleged the company was knowingly substituting foreign-made, lower-grade steel for the high-strength domestic steel specified in the multi-million-dollar contract. This saved the company a fortune. The whistleblower claimed these cheaper parts were brittle and prone to failure under stress. It was a damning accusation, but the article's last paragraph was the real kicker. The investigation was abruptly closed, it read, citing insufficient evidence after the primary witness recanted their testimony. Recanted. I knew what that meant. He'd been paid off, or threatened. This was it. This was the old business. Richard's father had built their fortune by selling junk to the military. He'd put soldiers at risk to line his pockets. And Richard, the man who finds my service unpleasant, had inherited that blood money. He wasn't just a draft dodger, he was the son of a man who preyed on the institution. Richard was too cowardly to even join. The reputational damage he was so scared of. It wasn't just a business problem, it was an explosive secret. If this came out, it would obliterate their carefully crafted image of legacy and integrity. But this was just an old, forgotten article. It was an allegation, not proof. The investigation was closed. To truly make them pay, I needed something more. I needed a smoking gun. And I had a feeling I knew how to find it. An old, buried newspaper allegation from 1980 was a start, but it wasn't proof. A smart lawyer, and the Hendersons could afford the best, would tear it apart as hearsay. The investigation was halted. The witness recanted. I needed something concrete, something that couldn't be explained away. There was only one person I trusted to help me navigate this, my old army buddy Jake. He was a signals intelligence analyst back in the day, a genuine whiz kid who could find a needle in a digital haystack. Now he runs a very successful and very private corporate security firm in Washington, D.C. He finds the skeletons that wealthy corporations try to bury. I called him. Jake, it's Mark. I need a favor. It's personal and it's off the books. I heard him lean back in his chair. Mark, haven't heard that voice in a while. Off the books is my expensive menu, old friend. What are we looking at? I didn't waste time. I laid it out. I'm looking into an old defense contractor, a shell company from the late 70s, CH Industrial. I have a strong reason to believe they were supplying substandard parts to the DoD, specifically vehicle fasteners. There was a silence on the line. Mark, that's a heavy accusation. Digging up 40-year-old DoD contracts isn't like a public records search. That's a deep dive. Why are you opening this can of worms? I took a breath. Because the man who inherited that company's fortune, a man who lives in a palace built on that money, just humiliated me for my service. He told my daughter my memories of the army were unpleasant. Jake let out a low whistle. Ah, so it's like that. Okay, I'm in. Those are the magic words. Give me 48 hours. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I paced my workshop. I tried to sand wood, but I couldn't focus. My mind was stuck in that digital search with Jake. Then, on the second night, an email landed in my inbox. It was from a secure, encrypted address. The subject line was simple. Got it. I opened the file. It wasn't one document. It was 3. First, there was the original contract showing CH Industrial was supposed to use high-grade U.S.-made steel. Second, there was a shipping manifest showing the parts were actually sourced from a cheap, overseas foundry known for low-quality materials. But the third document was the smoking gun. It was an internal quality assurance report from the company. A mid-level manager had flagged the parts. He'd run his own stress tests. The document was technical, but the summary was clear. Fasteners exhibit critical failure at 40% below the required military-grade specifications. Prone to shearing under pressure, do not ship. And right at the bottom of that manager's desperate all-caps warning was the override. A single, elegant signature in blue ink, dated 2 days later. Shipment approved, Charles Henderson. I stared at that signature. He knew. Richard's father knew he was sending garbage. He knew he was putting lives at risk, and he signed off on it anyway. I felt sick. This wasn't just fraud. This was a deep personal betrayal. I thought back. I tried to remember an accident with a supply truck, a rollover on a training exercise. We'd had incidents. We always blamed the driver or the terrain. But what if it was one of these cheap garbage bolts? What if Charles Henderson's greed had crippled someone I knew? This wasn't just about my grandson anymore. This was about every soldier who ever put their trust in the equipment they were given. Richard Henderson wasn't just protecting his reputation, he was protecting a fortune built on the broken bodies of my brothers. And now I had the proof. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the documents Jake had sent. The QA report with Charles Henderson's signature was my ace in the hole, the bullet for the final shot. But you don't use your best weapon first. First, you rattle the target. You make them panic. I printed out just one of the documents, the shipping manifest, the one that clearly showed the parts were sourced from that cheap, substandard overseas foundry, not the U.S. steel they'd billed the government for. It was damning, but it was also cryptic. It proved knowledge, but not the full extent of what I knew. It was the perfect bait. I went to my old typewriter, the one I keep in the closet. No hard drive, no digital footprint. I rolled in a plain white sheet of paper and typed out a single short sentence. Some of my friends were hurt because of this. We need to talk. I handled everything with gloves. I put the manifest and the typed note into a standard store-bought envelope. I didn't write a return address. That night, I drove 2 towns over to a place I had no connection with and dropped the envelope into a public mailbox. The trap was set. Then I prepared for the second stage. I went to a convenience store on the highway and bought a cheap, prepaid burner phone. I paid with cash and activated it using a fake name. This was my new, untraceable line of communication. I waited 3 days. 3 days of picturing that envelope landing on Richard's expensive desk. I imagined him opening it, his casual annoyance turning to confusion, then to cold, sinking dread as he recognized the manifest. He'd see the typed note and his blood would run cold. Some of my friends, he'd think it was a ghost, an old forgotten victim, a fellow veteran. He'd have no idea it was the quiet father-in-law he'd dismissed as a braggart. On the third evening, I switched on the burner phone. I typed in Richard's personal cell number, which I'd found easily during my initial research. My text was simple. You got my letter. We need to talk about CH Industrial. I hit send. The response was almost immediate. My burner phone buzzed less than a minute later. A new message from Richard. Who is this? What do you want? This is a mistake. He was panicked. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask, what is CH Industrial? He knew. His mistake plea confirmed everything. The fish had taken the bait and the hook was set deep. I let him sweat for an hour, then I replied, no questions, a public place. The Oakwood Diner on Route 5 tomorrow, 10 a.m. Come alone. He replied, I won't be threatened. I sent my final text. I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a chance to talk. If you're not there, these documents talk to a journalist instead. Your call. I turned off the burner phone. I knew he would be there. The arrogant, untouchable Richard Henderson was finally going to meet the unpleasant old soldier. And this time, it would be on my terms. The Oakwood Diner was old, smelling of stale coffee and grease. It was the perfect neutral ground. I got there at 9:45 a.m., took a booth in the far back corner facing the door. I ordered a black coffee and just waited. At 10:03 a.m., the bell on the door jingled. Richard Henderson walked in, followed by Eleanor. I was surprised to see her, but it made sense. He was too weak to face this alone. They both looked like they hadn't slept in days. Their expensive clothes looked out of place, and their faces were pale and drawn. But the arrogance was still there like a shield. They slid into the booth opposite me. Eleanor immediately went on the attack, her voice a low hiss. I don't know what pathetic little shakedown this is, she whispered, but you are playing with fire, Mark. You will regret this. Richard just stared at me, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and hatred. How much? He finally croaked. That's what this is, right? A payday. Name your price. Let's get this over with. I let out a small, quiet laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. Price? You think this is about money? I slowly reached into the manila envelope beside me. I pulled out the first document, the official letter from the Records Center. I slid it across the table. Let's start with this. Your low lottery number in 1976, and this, I tapped the letter. A confirmation that you never served. A fake medical diagnosis, I assume? Paid for by Daddy? Eleanor scoffed, though her eyes wavered. That? That's your big secret? My husband had a medical issue. It's ancient history. You have nothing. You're right, I said calmly. That is nothing. That was just for you, Eleanor. I wanted you to know the kind of fraud you've been sleeping next to. Her face tightened. Richard's jaw clenched. This, I said, reaching back into the envelope, is what matters. I pulled out the other, thicker set of documents. The shipping manifest, the internal quality assurance report, and the final page with Charles Henderson's signature right under the words, "Do not ship." I laid them on the table one by one. CH Industrial, I said, my voice low and cold. Substandard bolts, brittle fasteners, sold to the Department of Defense, sold to my people. Richard looked at the documents. His face didn't just go pale. It went gray. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut, all the air forced out of him. Eleanor snatched the QA report. She read the manager's desperate warning, then the override signature from Charles Henderson. Her hands began to shake. The mask of old money superiority didn't just slip. It shattered into a million pieces. She looked at Richard, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. You, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's true. You built your glass house on a foundation of blood money, Richard, I said, leaning in. You find my service unpleasant? You find my stories bragging? Your entire family fortune, your legacy, it was made by endangering men like me, by profiting from the very institution you were too cowardly to join. Richard opened his mouth. No sound came out. He looked at the documents, then at me. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was gone. In his place was just a small, terrified man, cornered by a truth he could no longer escape. They were silent, completely and utterly broken. I finally had them. I let the silence hang in the diner. It was heavy, broken only by the sound of a waitress refilling a coffee cup somewhere behind me. Richard and Eleanor just stared at the documents, their faces a mask of ruin. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was fear. What? What do you want? Richard finally whispered. He wasn't asking about money anymore. He was a defeated man asking for terms of surrender. I leaned back, taking a slow sip of my cold coffee. I'm not going to destroy you, I said, my voice quiet. Not completely. That would destroy my daughter. And I won't do that. I saw a tiny flicker of relief in Eleanor's eyes. I immediately stamped it out. But things are going to change. Effective immediately. Here are my terms, and they are not negotiable. I held up one finger. First, you will never again interfere with my relationship with my daughter or my grandson. You will not limit my time. You will not forget to invite me. You will not make a single negative comment about me. I am Leo's grandfather. You will respect that. I held up a second finger. Second, at the next family gathering, Thanksgiving is in 2 weeks. You will both apologize to me. In front of Sarah and David, you won't mention this. I tapped the documents. You will apologize for the years of disrespect. You will apologize for insulting my service. Richard bristled. An apology. It's not a request. I cut him off. Third, I slid the QA report with his father's signature across the table. This is blood money. You're going to give it back. You will make a substantial anonymous donation to the National Veterans Wound and Recovery Fund. I want a receipt. Anonymous, because you don't deserve to get public credit for this punishment. And if we say no, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. I gathered my documents, leaving copies of the manifest on the table. If you say no, I walk out of this diner, and these originals go to a friend of mine at the Boston Globe. He loves stories about old money hypocrisy. Your reputational damage will be the least of your problems. You'll be facing federal investigators by Tuesday. I stood up. They didn't move. They just stared at the papers. I saw Richard's shoulders slump. He gave a single jerky nod. We agree, he mumbled. I walked out of the diner. The apology at Thanksgiving was the most awkward, beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Eleanor's face was stiff with rage, but she said the words. Richard mumbled his. Sarah was confused, but I just smiled and told her it was a long overdue understanding. Things changed. The calls from Sarah came more often. The Hendersons were quiet, polite even. Last weekend I took Leo fishing, just the two of us, on my old boat. As he reeled in a tiny sunfish, he looked at me, his eyes bright. Grandpa, he said, Mommy told me you were a hero in the army. I just smiled and helped him with the hook. I was finally at peace. I had my family back. So, what do you think? Did I do the right thing, or did I go too far? What would you have done in my place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and don't want to miss the next one, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and join the conversation. Thanks for listening.